My day job is publishing Skeptic magazine and directing the Skeptics Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization. I got interested in the topics, which is pretty much any of the super interesting topics related to science and religion and spirituality and cults and free will and determinism and God. Pretty much all the great topics I'm interested in. Really goes back to being in college, and I was a born again Christian.
Hey, I'm Dave Rubin, and this is the Rubin Report. Reminder, everybody, you can get all our videos and audio podcasts absolutely ad-free and early at rubinreport.com. And joining me today is the publisher of Skeptic magazine, host of the Science Salon podcast, and author of the new book, Giving the Devil His Due, Michael Shermer. Welcome back to the Rubin Report.
Good to be back. The Tournament of Champions continues.
We've had a couple technical difficulties today to make this thing happen, but here we are. I know that as a man of faith, you're going to pray that our connection does.
I'm praying away. I'm not going to try to pray away the gay for you, but I'm going to try to pray away the coronavirus bugs in our computer systems here. It's the 5G, you see.
Oh, it's definitely the 5G. It's coming for everybody. It's spreading coronavirus and the rest of it. All right, there's a ton I want to get to here because I really love this book. And I just said to you right before we started that so much in my book as well, we really cover the topics, but come to slightly different conclusions on a couple things. And the way we approach the topics is a little bit different each time. But before we get to the book itself, you've written 16 books. And as a guy that just wrote one and knows what it takes to write one, how do you possibly not only come up with enough material, but enough sort of personal fortitude and patience and all of it to just be able to sit there and put all of those thoughts out 16 times, and quite successfully, by the way. It's not like nobody's reading these things.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, first of all, I'm 65, so I've got a couple of decades on you, or almost. Just cumulative time. But I also started writing in my 20s. When I was in college, I actually always wanted to be a writer. And then by the time I got to my early 30s, I had written quite a bit that wasn't published, just practicing stuff and trying to get things published, such that by my first book in 1997, so I was 33. No, it was 43. I had quite a bit of material. So, and
43 at my first book. I'm with you.
See, that's right. So each book kind of ends with a question of sorts, or in my mind anyway. That's the next book, and it's also a strategy when you're cutting. Because I usually write too much material, and then I think, oh, I really don't want to give this up. And I can talk myself into doing that by saying, I'll put it in the next book. And then it shortens that book. So you don't feel like you've wasted your time. But by temperament, I feel like if I don't write pretty much every day, it's like if I don't go work out, if I don't ride my bike, I feel anxious. Like I really need to write. I just have a kind of a need for it. And I know other people like, Isaac Asimov is that way. Apparently Stephen King is like that. They just got to crank out the material because it feels good. It's just sort of what I do, like an artist paints, I write, whatever. So I find a lot of, it's not a chore. I don't have, writer's block per se. I have time block. I just have, I just need more time because I enjoy it.
One of the things that I really like that you do, and it's not just in this book, it's in really all of your books, or at least the last few since I've known you, is you give credit to a lot of the other current thinkers that are talking about these things. And I think that's actually a kind of unique trait, because a lot of people want to sort of sit there and make it seem like they came up with all of this. But even I was looking at the blurbs in the back of the book, and actually it's a Rubin Report reunion over here, because you've got Steven Pinker, Jordan Peterson, Nadine Strawson, Nick Christakis, Amy Chua, and Jonathan Haidt. And these are people that you reference. They've all been on the show, which is nice. But that is one of the things that I like about this book, because you reference a lot of these people and their ideas as sort of the starting point or maybe midpoint for how you think about things. Were you always that way, that you would sort of hear somebody and kind of mirror what you think against them?
Yeah, to a certain extent. But as a writer and as a consumer of many other books, I can see some authors are more generous about crediting where their ideas came from and sort of tracking for the reader how they came up with their thesis of the book or whatever. Others, not so much. I'm not going to name any names, but some people do write in a way like they just came out of this whole cloth. It just popped into my brain like the muses, and no ideas happen like that. We all build on each other. Everybody does. And, in scholarly papers, you have to cite just tons and tons and tons of references. And that's why sometimes the reference sections are as long as the papers themselves. So, so I always felt like, well, I want to be generous and just sort of honest and say that here's where I came up with these ideas because of these 3 authors or these 16 sources or whatever. Anyway, so I just got in the habit of doing that just from training as experimental psychologist initially, and then a historian of science. You just have to do that. But just personally, I feel, when I see that someone like Richard Dawkins is very generous about that. He's, as is Steve Pinker, just citing where all these ideas come from, quoting other people. And it's like, I like that. I want to make sure I do that too.
Yeah. So one other thing before we dive specifically into the topics in the book, because you have now been on the Rubin Report at least 6 times, which places you at number 1, which I'm sure, despite your rather lofty resume, I'm sure that's clearly at the top of the list. But for somebody that's watching this right now that just doesn't know anything about you, can you just give me a 2 or 3 minute sort of recap on how you kind of became the skeptic?
Yeah, well, my day job is publishing Skeptic magazine and directing the Skeptics Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization. I got interested in the topics, which is pretty much any of the super interesting topics related to science and religion and spirituality and cults and free will and determinism and God. Pretty much all the great topics I'm interested in. Really goes back to being in college, and I was a born again Christian. I was in 1971 when I was in 11th grade. I had 2 close friends who were interested in converting me. I didn't even know what that meant, really. And George and Frank. So George had a really cute sister and invited me to church. So I thought, well, okay, here's my chance. But then when I got to the church, it was this Presbyterian church in Glendale, California. And the minister was unbelievably dynamic and just really motivating. And at the end, he said, come on up and you can accept Jesus. The whole thing will happen right here. And I'm like, all right, I'm going. So I went up. I didn't even know what I was doing, really. But I did it and then, took it pretty seriously. And then I went to Pepperdine University, which is a Church of Christ school and very conservative. And, Gerald Ford came to speak and Edward Teller came and gave his mutual assured destruction speech. And everyone was Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged and all that, pretty much what you'd expect. But then when I went to graduate school, I kind of drifted away from being religious, mainly for 2 reasons. One, studying social psychology, anthropology, sociology, I could see that other people's religious belief systems are very much context dependent, geographically dependent. So had I been born in India, I very likely would not be Christian. Had I been born 10,000 years ago, there would be no Christians, right? So, it seemed to me that doesn't make it wrong, but it makes it more likely to be mythically true, as our friend Jordan Peterson would say, not empirically true.
We're going to get into that.
Yeah. So, but then also the problem of evil, the theodicy. Why bad things happen to good people, and I'm not talking about like a human volition of homicide or war or something like that, but just like innocent children dying of leukemia, or thousands of children dying from starvation every year, and so on. It's like, why would a good God allow that to happen? I know there's tons of books and papers by theists and theologians about this, but to me, they've never squared that circle. They've never solved that problem, other than like Rabbi Kushner's famous book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. His conclusion was God simply can't do anything about it. He's just not he's not omniscient. I mean, he's not omnipotent. He may know everything, but he can't stop evil. Okay, so that's one solution. Another one is, well, there just is God, and that's the simpler solution to me. And that explains a lot, because if you understand the laws of physics and say the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, just shit happens. It's mostly just random, and there's very little directionality to why things happen other than just statistical probabilities, and that's it. There's nothing to explain. So like the coronavirus, what's the cause? 500 years ago, it would have been, well, women have been cavorting with demons in the middle of the night, or the Jews poisoned the well, or, some of these, crazy supernatural, paranormal, and race is bigoted. targeting of people's to, well, we don't do that anymore, except for the 5G craziness, because, we live in an age of science, and hopefully we've moved past that. So to me, once I left the church and really religion, I was still interested in answering the big questions, like, well, then where did the universe came from if there's no God? What's the origins of morality? What about consciousness? And, why is the universe tuned the way it is? Where did all this diversity of life come from? And, all the great questions from a secular perspective. So in trying to answer it myself, I thought, well, I want to write. So this is what I'm going to write about from a skeptical perspective. So my little niche, my lane, as they say, is, kind of on the margins of science, the pseudoscience and the paranormal, the supernatural, the sort of controversial stuff that most mainstream scientists don't deal with. That's my lane. And from there, I can tackle the great questions just from my particular perspective.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about academia instead of nonstop yelling, check out our academia playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, check out our full episode playlist. They're all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.